everyone. Hello. Okay. Okay. So, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm really very excited to be presenting Maarten van Smeden. He's an assistant professor now at the University of Leiden's Medical Center, but I've known Maarten for a long time. I met him on the just when he started his PhD studies at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. Maarten comes to us from two amazing groups. His PhD work with Professor Karl Mooms and Hans Reitzma of the University of Utrecht. Any of you who are involved in diagnostic test accuracy studies have heard about their contributions to that literature. And Maarten's own work was in the area of evaluating diagnostic tests in the absence of a perfect reference test, which is, of course, what luckily put us in contact. And Ian and Maarten and I were lucky enough to work on some papers jointly, following which Maarten moved to the University of Leiden, where again he works with some very interesting people on topics like measurement error, prediction models, and misclassification bias. And I'll just end by saying that Maarten writes very well. He's got a couple of nice papers I recommend that you read. One is a review on latent class models and how they're used, why they're not used more in the literature. And more recently, he's written something on sample size calculation for logistic regression models. I'm sure many of you in the audience, if you've tried a logistic regression model, you've heard that you must have at least 10 observations per 10 outcomes per variable. But apparently that's not a good idea or not a good enough idea. That's what Maarten's looked at more closely in the last year written about.
Don't tell us we need 20. They said we need 5.
We need much more than 20.
Oh.
Sorry.
Thank you, Maarten.
Thank you very much, Nandini. It's a great honor to be here, back in Montreal. So I'm going to talk about measurement error today, which is a topic that I really like and I think is really important. I think we often forget about measurement error when we do our analysis, or even in regular life. So for the people that are parents, you might recognize this, right? So if you go to the doctor at 8 weeks pregnancy, between 8 and 12 weeks pregnancy, at least in the Netherlands, they will measure your fetus. And what you can see is they will give you a measurement of the size of the fetus, and from that measurement of the size of the fetus, they calculate how old the fetus really is. On the day exact, right? This sounds like a nice idea. So this particular fetus was 8 weeks and 5 days, according to the measurement. The question is how certain are we about the age, really? How certain are we about this measurement? Now, of course, we have super accurate ultrasounds these days, right? Right. Well, maybe not. Maybe they underestimate it by 7 days, according to this paper. Well, that might not be such a big problem, but think about those patient management decisions that you make in case of preterm labor. So there's a 34-week cutoff, at least in the Netherlands, for giving medication to stop labor, or even resuscitation. So if you're off, of course, in that measurement, and you're right on the boundary of that 24 weeks, it's a life or death decision. What we're looking at is measurement error, right? And this is just in practice. Of course, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a statistician, so I don't know much about this. And my work is specifically in epidemiology. And I think measurement error in epidemiology is a big problem. So before I'm going to talk about this, just have a little bit of terminology and notation, which is just common epidemiology notation, I think. I'm going to talk about exposure. And if you're not from epidemiology, exposure means the covariates typically of interest, which we often denote by A or sometimes X, but especially in the causal inference literature, it's A. We have a set of confounders, covariates to be taken into account, not directly of interest, L1 to LP, and we have an outcome, so a response variable, with the conventional notation Y. I'm going to talk about measurement error in a very broad sense, because I think misclassification, which is sometimes seen as something completely different, is actually a special case of measurement error. Most of the things that go wrong when you have measurement error will go wrong if you have if you have categorical outcomes, so misclassification. And last part about terminology, and I will not show a lot of equations here, but if I do, I'm gonna use the asterisk sign to denote a variable with error. So A would be an exposure, A star would be an exposure with measurement error. So how large is this burden of measurement error in epidemiology? Well, fortunately, we all do systematic reviews, so we know. So this was a systematic review done, published in 2006, but about literature in 2001. So it's almost 20 years ago, by Jurek and Greenland and some other people. And what I've looked at is, they looked at 57 papers in depth from the epi literature. And what they see is that 61% actually talks about measurement error in their paper, all right? Now, only one uses some kind of quantitative approach to address the measurement error. And 16 do a sort of a qualitative approach to measurement error. For example, saying that non-differential measurement error was present, so there must have been attenuation of the effects. And they looked in such detail that in the end their conclusion is only one of the 57 papers had exposure gender that in our opinion could be measured with a negligible amount of measurement error. So their conclusion is it's not great, at least not in 2001. But it's almost 20 years ago, so now it must be better, right? Well, we looked at that in 2016, so we did a sort of the same type of approach. We looked at not only at epidemiology papers, but also at general medicine papers. And what you see is that if we look at, we looked at 337 from the top-ranked epidemiology literature papers, you can see that there's still a lot of talk about measurement error, so 56 compared to the 61% in 2001 that are talking about measurement error in some sense in the paper, and only 25 in the general medicine. And still only 3% uses quantitative approaches to actually address the measurement error problem. So it's very similar, I guess, than to the situation almost 20 years ago. What we also saw in that review is that there are quite some simple heuristics among I think, epidemiology researchers, especially about measurement error structure. So a lot of people are talking about non-differential error, which was about 30% of the papers that talk about measurement error say it's non-differential or differential error for some reason, about how it impacts the results. So a lot of people, almost 50%, say it will create attenuation bias, which means bias towards the null. And solutions. You see a lot of people arguing that there's problem of measurement error is something inherent to epidemiology, so we can't solve it. So if you look very closely at what people say, you see a lot of myths. And that's why we wrote a paper, and that's what I'm presenting today. So I'm going to talk about 5 myths about measurement error, one by one. So the first myth is measurement error can be compensated by a large number of observations, which sounds silly, and it is, but I have quotes. So sometimes even data of limited quality may be better if one has a huge amount of it compared with only a small amount of data of high quality. This is what people write down, right? So let's think about that for a minute. Let's say we have 80 patients, and if these are just the measurements from every consecutive patient, this is their truth. Let's assume that there is some measurement error. So that means, in this case, not a biased measurement error, just sort of, this is actually a sort of a random measurement error. So the error fluctuates randomly around the truth. Now, what happens if I use this in research, this type of data? Because usually I don't know the truth, I only have the error. But what if I had them both? We can think about estimating a mean. So here is estimating a mean from every consecutive patient. And what you see is that at the start, the confidence intervals around the estimate for the mean with a high, with error, are much wider, right? But they sort of converge to the same truth, right? So from this I would say the measurement error problem is a problem of precision, right? The difference between the truth and the error is precision, the width of the confidence interval, which becomes smaller, of course, once you get more patients. So this is actually something that's great for that that first what they are saying here. Of course, if it's really just a precision issue, measurement error, then we can solve it with larger data sets. Okay? But this is a simple setting. What we often see is that measurement error actually creates bias. And this is a very simple example where I have measurement error in X, and if I increase the measurement error in X, my slope will tilt. And this is a visual example of what we call attenuation bias. So the slope becomes less high, so the regression coefficients become smaller when I increase the amount of measurement error in X. So this bias.
Sorry, this is differential?
No, no. This non-differential error, completely random error. Random error in X and no measurement error in Y. So we'll attenuate your effect, so your effect will become smaller. There's another thing that we often don't think about is that if you have a lot of measurement error, actually relations that might be nonlinear will not show up in your data anymore. It just becomes big clouds instead of nicely arranged points. And those three problems we call the triple whammy of measurement error. So the large sample size, that idea of that a large sample size sort of resolves the problem of measurement error, well, that may be true for some lost precision that we saw in one of the earlier slides, where if you estimate a mean, it may only be a problem of precision. But the compensation that you need actually for getting similar precision might be 50 times as large sample size, depending on how much measurement error there is. And also, precision and power doesn't always decrease with measurement error, especially if you have bias. Then estimators that are biased might actually come with higher precision and higher power, but the problems are still there. A large sample size has no direct effect on the measurement error bias, of course, and no direct effect on that masking problem. So to summarize myth 1, maybe when it comes to precision, but the things we really should care about, which is, I think, bias, isn't solved with bigger samples. Before I continue, there's a distinction to be made, or a terminology to be clarified. When we talk about univariate measurement error, which means just measurement error in one of the variables you have measured, we often make the distinction between non-differential and differential measurement error. And non-differential measurement error in the exposure is when the error is independent of the outcome. The same can be said, but in the other direction. Measurement error in the outcome is said to be non-differential if the error is independent of the exposure. Now, if you come in a situation where you have multiple variables with error, you have to think about differential error, but it's also good to think about possible dependence. So measurement error in the exposure is independent if the error is independent of the error in y, in the outcome. Or measurement error in the outcome is independent if the error is independent of the error in the exposure. And as you can see, things with measurement error quickly becomes very complicated. And that's also one of the reasons why we suggest to look at it from a quantitative perspective, because only a qualitative perspective, thinking about this, is really, really hard. Now there's a second myth, and I think that's one of the most common problems, is that the effect of exposure is underestimated when variables are measured with error. This is a quote: "The bias in estimates of association are towards the null, leading to underestimation of any positive or inverse relationship." Or, "Given the inherent precision of these exposures, our estimated hazard ratio were probably subject to non-differential misclassification bias," which I assume is what they mean is bias towards null. These are not ridiculous examples, by the way. This American Journal of Epi and International Journal of Epi, so not crazy papers. What is this ID, right? That I showed. Is that the larger the measurement error, the more the slope tilts towards null, so the less effect, so to say.
What exactly is happening in that graph?
The only thing what you see here is that the x values, they get a measurement error, and the measurement error becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. They move away from their true value. So at the start of this picture, there's no measurement error, this is no measurement error, and then they get pulled away in a random fashion. So this is non-differential measurement error. Now, one thing I think that we will all agree on is that there's a big difference between underestimation and bias. An attenuation bias is defined as an expectation. So what we can say is that the effect of Z is underestimated in a study Y because of measurement error in X. So very simply, you know this graphs, right? From bias and variance stuff. So go quickly through this. This is no bias or bias. No bias, right? It's just scattered around the bullseye. This is a bit bias. So no bias and a bit of bias and high variance. But the point is, of course, is that if you have high variance and bias, that means that some of those point estimates may still be away on the other side of the dot. So saying in your study your effect is underestimated because you have measurement error is a bit of an overstatement. Bias is not the same as error. So what is attenuation bias? When do you get it? Well, before you can claim that, you have to make some assumptions, and the most important assumptions are listed here. First of all, the error has to be in the exposure. If it's in the confounder, it doesn't work. If it's in the outcome, it may also work, but it doesn't always work that way. The error must be non-differential. We talked about that. If it's differential error, bias can be either way. But it also cannot be, in some settings, it cannot be systematic. Systematic means it has a different intercept. So it's systematically higher or systematically lower. which might not be differential because it might be still be independent of the outcome. And it must be additive. Otherwise, you are not sure about attenuation bias. The effect is not effect modification, interaction, or mediation. If you look at that, then things become really problematic with measurement error. So that bias can go towards null and up. It cannot be a discrete variable with 3 or more categories. I think the most important thing in epidemiology is all other variables cannot be measured with error too, to claim attenuation bias. At least not overall bias. So to illustrate that, this is a very simple example with non-differential error. So I have 3 categories, 0, 1, and 2. And there is measurement error between categories 1 and 2. And we can analyze that with a simple linear regression model. And what you will see is that x1 will go up, x2 will go down, which means that x1, although it's non-differential error, you'll see that the coefficients for on the non-differential error for x1 will go up, and for x2 it will go down. So it's in opposite directions in this case. This is just an illustration that if you have multiple categories as a exposure variable and you have measurement error, even if it's non-differential, it might still go in an unexpected direction. Other variables measured with error was another assumption that there cannot be other variables measured with error. If you want to claim attenuation. We wrote a illustrative paper about that, looking at Cox proportional hazards models with an outcome cardiovascular events, which is MI, stroke, or cardiovascular death. And what we did was simulating non-differential error to the exposure and one of the confounder variables, just to see what happens. And if you like this, to look at this in more detail, the code is online. So this was one of the main results. So systolic blood pressure, was the exposure variable. And here we have 2 different confounders. And what you see in the first picture is that you see that there's attenuation, so that the effect will go down up to 29% or to 65%, or even 70% for the combination of large measurement error. And the measurement error here is expressed as the percentage of the variance that is explained by measurement error. So in this case, 50% is real variation and 50% is measurement error, which is not a very weird thing actually in epidemiology. So you might run into a minus 70% bias in this setting. And it's in both, so attenuation, you see attenuation with measurement error in the exposure, and you see attenuation with measurement error in the diastolic blood pressure. So actually inflated attenuation. Although this is actually the picture you might actually expect more. That is attenuation still with measurement error in the exposure, but because the confounder is measured with error, you get residual confounding. So the 2 cancel. And you might end up with a higher estimate, a very positive bias or negative bias, depending on, again, the exact measurement error. So I like this quote. It's from Carroll. The idea that we can ignore measurement error and that it all runs to null effects is lovely and appealing folklore, sometimes true, but unfortunately very often wrong. All right, any questions about these two myths before I go to the third? All right. So myth 3, exposure measurement error is non-differential if measurements are taken without knowledge of the outcome. Another quote, exposure due to self-report is most likely non-differential. Whatever. Or residual measurement error may be present. The prospective design makes it more likely that such errors would be random. Let's formalize this a bit. I don't know whether you like DAGs, but I have one DAG for you. This is just the DAG for exposure to outcome. You're all familiar with DAGs, I assume. This is the confounder, maybe multiple confounders. Now this is one way to visualize measurement error. So we have the exposure, and we have the exposure measured with error, and an unknown, or at least unmeasured, factor that is the error. And differential error is just the relationship between y and that error. Now, why are we so worried about differential error? Is because people think, at least, and I think that's true, it has a particular strong effect on exposure effect estimate, and it may be in unexpected directions. So you might have attenuation bias, but it might also be bias away from them. That's why people are afraid of differential error. And the classic example that you always get, I guess, for differential error is when you have retrospectively collected data, as in a case control study. So that cases have better recollection or over-report their exposure more than the controls, after experiencing the outcome, of course, already. Providers are now blinded to the outcome status if they have to evaluate the exposure. Or even sometimes that different methods of exposure measurements are used for case and controls. It's all possible. All sources of differential measurement error. And the idea is that the differential measurement error is so because the outcome precedes the registration of the exposure status. Right? But is that necessary? Well, one simple counterexample from White. Think about this. Think about the situation where you're interested in family history on some of a particular disease on that disease. Well, those with a very strong family history of that disease might have more accurate recollection of their family history than those without. And subsequently, they might, those with the strong family history, also have a higher risk of future disease. So there is a relationship then between the disease and the recollection, the quality of the recollection, so the error. So differential misclassification in the exposure, that's something went wrong there. So it really means that the non-differential exposure measurement error is violated as the measurement error in exposure is not independent of the true value of the outcome. So the outcome doesn't have to precede the measurement of the exposure to have non-differential measurement error. Another thing that we often do is categorize variables. But that with variables that are measured with error might not be such a good idea, which is this. I like this table by Wacholder. And what you can see is that, very simply, there's non-differential misclassification, and then you have three categories, and then you combine low and high. And for the true exposure, you have an odds ratio of 2. Now, if you have a misclassified exposure, which is non-differential, You combine low and high, and you get suddenly an odds ratio that's higher. So it's bias away from null, the same as you would expect on a differential misclassification. Now, myth 4, measurement error can be prevented but not mitigated. Like Nandini already said, I wrote my thesis about diagnostic research in the absence of a gold standard. And one of the first paper I read was about this. Anybody an idea what this is? Sorry? A parasite. Which one? Well, it's her paper. Yeah. It's strongylitis. This I really like this paper, which was one of the reasons why I spent 7 months here in Montreal, by Lawrence Joseph. And what they looked at was the problem of, I will say now, measurement error. I'll come back to that. What they looked at was Cambodian refugees here in Montreal, arriving between 1982 and 1983, and they did a test for strongyloides. And this is the 2x2. And now the question is, what is the prevalence of strongylitis? That was the question in those people. So what do I do? Anybody? How do I estimate the prevalence of strongylitis? I guess the question is, what is the reference standard, right? What is the reference standard? Well, we don't know. Both might be imperfect, so let's try them both. Well, first you can take stool examination and calculate the prevalence, and that's about a quarter. And then you take serology, and then it's about 3/4 of prevalence. So the combined confidence interval is something between 0.2 and 0.8, and both are imperfect, so the real confidence interval is here between 0 and 1. So you've learned nothing, right? That's the problem. Now there are solutions to this, and this paper actually gives a very interesting example. And I think about that now in a different way than I did when I finished this thesis. I actually think that this is a measurement error problem. We always talk about gold standard problems. We forget this is really a measurement error problem. Because diagnostic studies are studies of measurement, of the index test we're interested in, and those commonly suffer from measurement error problems, measurement errors in the reference standard. The reference standard can sort of be conceptualized as the outcome of your study, and the index test as the exposure, so to say. And why I show this is, I think this is important. If we want to make progress in measurement error, we have to realize that we have already done so much work on measurement error. It's not a new problem, right? We just in some settings we just call it differently. And we tried to address the problem of measurement error in TB. This paper was mainly written by Samuel Schumacher, and Nandini, and Lawrence, and Monica Pai. And the goal is to get a sort of a conceptual model for the measurement error. That is, here we have a bunch of tests, and here we have things that we don't measure, latent variables, and here are other things that we don't measure. And maybe you see the relationship also to DAGs here. So solving the problem, and I will not go into detail because I need another hour. The idea of solving measurement error is very similar to what we already do in epidemiology, thinking about structures and how things relate to each other, and then try to get the real signal out of the data that we're interested in. All right. So I'm just going to name a few measurement error approaches that we often see in literature. So what I've just showed you is a latent variable model. That's what we use, the latent class model, which is a special case again of a latent variable model. So we have multiple variables of imperfect measurements of an outcome, that's the diagnostic test, and what we do is try to approximate the true outcome. Now we have also something that's called regression calibration, and it's sometimes used in especially nutritional epidemiology. And what you do is, for a selective sample typically, you get true measurements, and for the other people you get the imperfect measurements, and also for those people in the subset. So in the subset you have true measurements and faulty measurements, so to say. And what you do is actually replacing those faulty measurements with a prediction of the truth. That's regression calibration. There's another weird thing that's called Cmax, which you see more and more. Is what you do is actually simulating extra error on your exposure or any variable with error. And what you will see is that if you simulate that error, the estimate will go to a certain direction, and then you extrapolate back to the situation without error. That's the sort of the idea of Cmax. And something I think is also very interesting, and some people have already used that, it's called MIME. We use multiple imputation to try to solve measurement error. So we have a lot of that stuff already here. We just don't really use it yet. It's not true that there are no books about this. There are many excellent books written about how to solve measurement error. This one is very technical, this one too. This is, if you're Bayesian oriented, a very good book. And this is where it all started, sort of. I don't have experience with this book. All right, last myth. Certain types of epidemiologic research are unaffected by measurement error. So this is another quote. We are aware that one measurement is not precise of our outcome. We use the same definition for both intervention and control, which will neutralize the effect. Well, that's great. We looked at that. And that's only true in very specific situations. So if there is measurement error that's so-called classical, so non-differential with some extra assumptions, then you only get a loss of power. Unfortunately, if measurement error is differential or systematic, you get loss of power, inflated type 1 error, etc. So even if you are doing a trial, you should probably worry about your measurement error in your outcome. We have a preprint about that, showing and suggesting some alternative estimators, and we also give some new software to actually implement those measurement error corrections. And how about prediction models? Because prediction models is more or less my thing. This is a quote from Statistics in Medicine. It rarely makes sense to worry about measurement error in prediction research. Is that true? First of all, just a bit of background. What is prediction models? What we typically do is we have a bunch of people and we collect all kinds of data from them, so age and BMI, and then we put it in some kind of algorithm, sometimes logistic regression. These days it looks more like deep learning. And then at some point a prediction model rolls out, right? That's how we build prediction models these days. What's very important to realize is that we're not interested in predicting the people that we actually observed. So the performance of a prediction model on the data you have collected to develop the model is not so interesting. We want to use it in future patients, right? That's how it works. Well, we have written about this too. What you see is that if your measurement error, or if the measurements of your predictors, so that might be exposures or confounders in a causal setting, if you have higher measurement error, you get problem with your discrimination, because, well, predictors with measurement error are usually worse predictors, which is something you might expect. And differences between those the developments or the people that you have used to develop the prediction model and measurements that you use in validation can impact the discriminative performance in a different way. A recent paper, which will be soon on online in Statistics and Medicine, we looked at also this idea that measurement error might differ between that development and validation setting, right? So in some settings, you might have a very good small data set with very accurate measurements, and you build a prediction model on that. Say it's from a trial, protocolized measurements of everything. What if you apply that same prediction model in a setting that's not a trial, so not protocolized? That's more or less the question that we had. Especially what goes on with the calibration of the prediction model. The calibration of the prediction model, what we mean with that is how accurate the risks are that come from that prediction model. Not sure whether you're familiar with this, but these are so-called calibration plots. And what you see is that if we have a setting where there is more measurement error in the validation set, so the very accurate in the development, but less accurate in the validation, we get a super overfitted model. So the risk predictions are going towards the extremes. And the same holds also for the reverse. So if you have messy data, say electronic health records, they're not all messy, but typically they're messy, and you then apply it to a setting that's not electronic health records, then you might be in this situation, where you get underestimated risks, or risks that are towards the prevalence, which we call underfitting. Do you have any idea what the correlation will be because this is a one predictor model? Do you think what would be the correlation with this between the truth and the one with error? You have any idea? Because this is gigantic, this miscalibration. Any idea what kind of correlations we're looking at? It's still high. This example is a correlation of 0.75. So a correlation of 0.75 with the truth might really screw up your model. So there are many, many more types than only prediction and trials. People have looked at mediation analysis and the problem of measurement error, record linkage, time series analysis, Mendelian randomization, genome-wide, negative controls, diagnostic accuracy, disease prevalence studies. There's all literature everywhere about measurement error, the problem, and also ways to solve it. So to summarize, there were 5 myths about measurement error that I discussed. The first one was measurement error can be compensated with a large number of observations. The second one was exposure effect is underestimated when variables are measured with error. Third one was measurement error is non-differential if measurements are taken without knowledge of the outcome. Fourth was measurement error can be prevented but not mitigated. And the fifth, certain types of epidemiologic research are unaffected by measurement error. I think they're all wrong, but of course, if you have other ideas, please tell me. I think the sentence that we often hear about, especially when you talk to researchers that aren't epidemiologists, they always tell you that correlation doesn't imply causation. I think the problem of measurement error is really that correlation doesn't imply correlation, unfortunately. So the problem actually of measurement error is much bigger than we think. So we wrote a paper about the myths of measurement error with my boss, Rolf Groenwold, and Timothy Lash from Atlanta. It will be soon on archive, which I will share via Twitter. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
That was a really nice talk. Thanks. So I'm sort of an applied epidemiologist. So I am doing a lot of regressions with data that has measurement error. I ignore it. I try not to use phrases like probably biases towards null if it's not differential. But in this sort of potential methods to explore the impact of measurement error, one that appealed to me, mostly because I can more or less understand it, would be to sort of simulate or add in measurement error to various variables and see how sensitive your inference is to these parameters. So
Yeah. CMAX.
is that I mean, SIMX is how commonly used is this approach in the actual literature? I mean, I read a lot of like clinical journals where
Yeah.
you very rarely see these things like you mentioned.
Right.
Is this something that can easily be implemented or requires
I think so. The question is it easy to implement this kind of methods in applied research? And I think yes, but you need to think about it, unfortunately, in the design of your study. So especially when you think about this regression calibration or CMAX, what you want is to have, at least for a small group of people, you want the truth. And if you can arrange that, there's a lot you can solve with measurement error. If you don't have that, like the problem in the gold standard that we try to solve, that's much more difficult and much more unstable. Now the CMAX, that's intuitively appealing indeed. So you increase the error and you see where the point estimate is going and you go back. The problem is how far do you go back? So you need something about the distance between what you have measured and the truth still. So it still needs a bit of that input. Now the last thing I want to say about this, one of the big problems I think is software. We don't have user-friendly software right now for measurement error. But our group is of course working on that. Advertisement. And I think we do try to make this more accessible because I think that's one of the hurdles now to take. Although CMAX has an R package, and regression calibration can now be done with R package, so it can be done. But it's it's.
it sounds complicated. There's the exposure of interest, there's all the covariables, there's the interaction terms, there's the outcome. All of those could have. I mean,
Measurement error. Yeah.
High-dimensional problem
Yeah.
quickly.
So I think what we one step at a time probably, right? But if you have measurement error, especially in the exposure, I would try to solve it. And multivariable, so joint measurement error, so they sometimes call it, or what I call it multivariate measurement error, is a very complex problem. And CMAX doesn't work very easily with that, for example. So not all those approaches scale very easily to the multivariate measurement error problem. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. I work in a field where we have measurement error all the time. I'm assessing patient-reported outcomes, self-reported outcomes. We deal with things like response shift. I'm going to be in
Yep.
Leiden at a whole response shift think tank in September. All of these things cause a huge mess.
Yep.
So in this mess, I do a lot of trials. And one of the things that I keep fighting against is adjusting for baseline. When I have measurement error in the Y, and then I'm adjusting for the baseline, which also has measurement error in the Y, and I keep refusing to do that, and everybody gets hysterical that you always have to adjust for the baseline. And then everybody will say, well, assume there's no measurement error. Well, I know there's measurement error. So is there some sort of way forward with this?
With the trials specifically.
For baseline?
Yeah, so there have been papers written about, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, by Stephen Walter, for example, about correct. Yeah, Frank Harrell too. And they always say, indeed, adjust for baseline. And I think the consensus is now, if there is measurement error in the baseline characteristics, it doesn't matter, right? Because, well,
But it's the baseline value.
yeah.
It's the baseline value of your outcome.
But the problem, of course, becomes if both your outcome and the baseline characteristics are measured with error, and there might be dependence between them. And I have never seen a paper, which is a good idea actually, to look at that in more detail.
Please.
We haven't looked at that. We just looked at
The errors are correlated.
yeah.
The error in the y is correlated with the error in the x, and likely correlated with your other x's that are in this.
Yeah. So that this is a very interesting paper to write and research and research to do. So what we have done here, this paper, is just look at the situation where you don't correct for it,
Right.
especially for this reason, because then it becomes very complicated. And this is already complicated to correct measurement error in the outcome.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'll look at this. Thanks.
We have time for one more question. Nisha, I had a question.
Yeah, she says, just wondering, because in some of the more rigorous IP journals, they'll ask you to do sensitivity analysis. And
Yeah.
I think that's maybe a little more quantitative way of looking at it than your qualitative non-differential
Yeah.
bias. And what's your take on that? Because I know I've had to, look at these 5 or 10 different sensitivities based on, say 10% or 20% error in your
Yeah.
exposure, and then see how that affects your outcome.
Yeah.
And that's a less fancy way than using software, but what is your take on that?
So I think this idea of I think my co-author Timothy Lesh would call that bias analysis. We'll call it bias analysis, and what he has suggested in his books, I think, is indeed this approach in the sensitivity analysis way, which is great if you don't have data to really correct for it. But I think if we really want to solve it, then we need better measurements, first of all, because better measurements are just better. But if you cannot get perfect measurements for everybody, get for a small group of patients good measurements, even if it's outside of your trial. If you get information outside is also fine. There are also methods that can deal with that. I think that's a better approach. And I also think that the sensitivity analysis are still not often enough used. So I prefer a more rigorous approach, but I like the sensitivity analysis. But we included those in our systematic review. And they're still very, not often done in the top epi journals. Yeah.
I'll ask one question.
Uh-oh.
And that is that, you listed 4 methods over there as potential solutions, and like you pointed out from the literature reviews you began with, those methods, we know about them, but still they're not applied. I just wonder if we don't, as practitioners, methodologists, don't end up confusing people who want to apply those methods, because those 4 different methods all look the same to me. Like you say, you want to inject some kind of information in here to solve the problem. Whether you do that by way of a prior distribution or by having information on a small piece of your data set, I think it amounts to the same thing. So are those 4 methods really different, or is it like calling God by 4 different names?
I think they are very similar. You're right. But they have been developed by different people that like their own method best. So they did some good branding, so to say. Although I do think is that if you use latent variables, so you have typically, but you can, but typically you don't have partly gold standard observations, then your setting is really different. Although we have seen also latent variable models where they use this same approach. So it would be very interesting to look at that in more detail, but I haven't done so far.
We'll be doing so, Maarten, in the future.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.